Hello, welcome to the Tulsa Times podcast. I'm your host, Patrick McNicholas, the creator of Time Travel Tulsa, and as always, I'm joined with fellow Tulsa historian John Beasley. In this show, we discuss Tulsa's past, present, and future. So let's get started and talk Tulsa Times. Thanks for joining us for the 6th edition of the Tulsa Times podcast. First of all, it's great to be back, and as you can imagine, things get in the way sometimes. It's been a really busy time for the both of us, but we are glad to be back here on the mic and ready to share some interesting things we found regarding the Arkansas River. And who better to have than Riverview Beasley?
Thank you, Patrick. I am glad to be here. As always, it's been too long. Good to see you.
Obviously there's a long natural history of the river, but also in more recent times, significant developments as kind of what's on everybody's lips right now and in the news. When we talk recent, we're going to be talking within the last few hundred years. But we're going to talk about that and everything coming up. But first, we're going to jump in and, as we usually do, talk about some recent developments and some updates, just some things that are happening right now. And in reality, our listeners are really getting 2 episodes worth because I just released a video for the video presentation that I did at the Tulsa Historical Society, and John was there making the mark. That was about a month ago from the recording of this.
That's a great one, and that's a great story, how that all happened to come together with you, not only being in the right place at the right time, but being aware and recognizing what you were dealing with the demise of that significant monument.
Yeah, and so for people that follow me, you probably have seen the monument or heard the monument or this monument, that monument. Basically what happened was there was a significant monument commemorating our first Tulsa street sign placed in 1935, if you can believe it. But long story short, that monument was destroyed, broken in half, but was repaired and preserved by a benchmark monument, and that's the whole story behind the video. But the event really took a lot of research and everything, so there's a whole lot of behind the scenes and how the monument ended up on that corner. And it's not the end of the story either. That monument's going to be going back to that corner, but available at my website, tulsapast.com, and YouTube. And then another thing that's happened, it's really started with this podcast, episode 2, when we were talking about mines. I finally came together and put together this reel that I've been meaning to do for a while, and it basically went viral online. I got a lot of new followers, over 500 so far, and still going strong out there. But
I have heard a lot more about mines and people asking about the mines just since that episode. It's those little things that most people just didn't know. I was glad that we were able to incorporate some of that in the tour that you and I gave for Tulsa Foundation for Architecture there at the fairgrounds with the pavilion, and talking about that old Bruce Goff structure that was there at the racetrack and how significant the mines were, and how you can still, get the impression today of what was going on back then based on the lay of the land, based on the way the roads and the former railroad tracks were laid out.
Definitely. And, everyone goes to the fairgrounds, but it's hard to, visit every little bit of it, like we were talking about with the TFA tours. But other recent and current events, we're going to be talking about this here in a little bit more, but the raft race returns for Labor Day, and that's more than just the raft race. They kind of have it, the Big Dam party.
The Big Dam Party, yes.
Which I'm not cursing. That's actually the other dam that you're thinking
reference
of.
To the new low water dam.
And then again, the Tulsa Drillers took advantage of that. The Raft Racers rebrand, which is from August 14th to the 18th. So there's going to be a lot
of fun. Yes, I love the way they switch it up with them. And yeah, I think honoring Tulsa, the River City, with Raft Racers is great. Obviously, I'll be buying some T-shirts. And it's going to be a lot of fun. Let's see, what did we do? We did Noodlers. That was a few years ago. And was it last year that was Tulsa Sound?
Yeah, there
So,
was, and they were, their merchandising team, and I guess just
oh yeah,
really,
for
I
sure.
guess minor league baseball in general has been really doing it good with their merchandising, and obviously some historic things. But I remember telling people, I have the Noodlers hat, and I told them that the Drillers were called the Noodlers, and they almost lost it because they didn't realize it was, a short time
Yes.
rebrand and
Yep.
and not an exact change of names. But some other news we got here. Before that, we have June 28th, Stella Adams joins Buck Adams along Route 66. So, Mary Beth's done it or will do it again. And I remember I
Indeed.
was working when they put in Buck Adams, and I was working at Channel 6 at the time, and we had the helicopter. So I kind of had this unique view of it getting, set up.
Right.
So yeah, I remember that specifically, and that was a number of years ago. So this again, Stella Adams is the female muffler woman, I guess.
We are so fortunate to have Mary Beth in this town. She is, yep, she's a good one. Certainly makes a tremendous difference. Not only in all the things that she does, but just her physical presence. She has this aura. She is just, if you are around or near Mary Beth Babcock, you will be happy for sure.
That's not only going to get attention here locally, but nationally with Route 66, because I know for a fact that's going to be, not only has it been a, one-stop shop attraction, for a number of years, it's going to be even more visited as well as the upcoming 100-year anniversaries. But national news in general, there's a lot of talk about the Outsiders in Tulsa. People Magazine, New York Times, and of course the Outsiders musical on Broadway. But if you like it or not, Outsiders, we're kind of partial, of course. But I would say, it is introducing a whole nother type of people to Tulsa, and really telling a whole nother story that, is one of the better literary novel, I guess.
Yeah, no. Susie Hinton, a real Tulsa treasure. And big thanks to, our guy, Danny O'Connor. Danny
boy.
Irish guy. But
Danny whatever his last name is. Yeah.
Because when he took on that project now, 5 or so, 6 years ago, with revitalizing the house and the Crutchfield neighborhood, a lot of people, hadn't thought about Outsiders in a while. Now it's routinely playing at the Admiral Twin Drive-In. And yeah, it's getting this national news as well. So it is exciting. I can't wait for the show to come to Tulsa. Don't see myself going to Broadway anytime soon. Love to, just a little busy with things Tulsa.
And like you said, yeah, it's going to be coming here in the fall 2025, 2026, sticking around to 2026.
Looking forward to it already. One of the things I do want to mention, because, as we do updates, and since it has been a little while, one of the things that I'm most excited about, and we still see, continued development, redevelopment, revitalization, whatever you want to call it, of our downtown area, specifically in the art district. But Santa Fe Square is finally happening. I know that Elliot Nelson, had this plan for a long time to utilize what was essentially a parking space. I mean, I'd park there, I don't know how many times. Actually, the biggest thing to happen in that 2 square block area that is on the northeast corner of, 2nd and Elgin, is D-Fest. If you remember D-Fest back from, the early 2000s or so?
Yeah.
No, great times. Anybody, certainly above the age of 30.
JFJO opened for Zappa Plays Zappa, followed by The Roots, who also was at the Gathering Place.
Yes, opening Gathering Place.
So there was connections there, but as far as other things that Tulsa related, and all opinions aside on this one, but the TV show Tulsa King was picked up by CBS, so that's part of their bigger I mean, just being picked up by CBS and being syndicated on that level, people are going to have a new concept of Tulsa, not
Right.
necessarily, but
Which is
there
like
were a
in
lot of
name
people,
only, right?
yeah, in name only. But they're what the difference is when the syndication they're starting it from season one, so it's just
Gotcha.
they're
Okay.
the stuff they're filming now is going to be for what I yeah well, I don't
Season
understand, but
3 or
it's
so.
two.
That's
I think two's
in
they took
Atlanta
some
or
break,
somewhere
yeah,
in Georgia.
Atlanta, I believe.
Like that isn't more oppressive heat and
Yeah, I
humidity.
know.
I don't get it, but okay.
He's an interesting fella.
Hey, idiot.
You know, all the talk about Tulsa now versus what it was, you know, just a decade ago. I think, you know, people have a better concept of where it is in the country and
True.
maybe who we
Yes.
are, I guess, to a certain degree. But sports news for those soccer fans in town, the Tulsa Athletic were suspended from season play after winning it all last year. So there's really not too much to explain other than the league is not big fans of the team, and they say that we don't play at a park that meets their quality, which it obviously does, and but they're having to play outside of their league, and they have a game coming up later this week, which is unfortunately interfering with Tulsa Tough activities, Crybaby Hill, and that's also this weekend. So a busy kind of sports weekend in Tulsa, and we've honestly had some really great weather, even though it's a little warm today, but it's still got a breeze out there and everything. So
Yeah, this is a crazy weekend coming up. This is one of those signature weekends in Tulsa, kicking off Pride Month. This is First Friday coming up, followed by Second Saturday, interestingly, the way the calendar works out this time. But yeah, so we do have Golf Fest going on right now. They are setting up on the River Parks trails already for Tulsa Tough, which begins, which is this weekend. Yeah, Sunday is going to be huge. Love Crybaby Hill, specifically of Tulsa Tough. I will be at Spotlight Theater all day on Sunday. We are offering race fans cold air conditioning, cool drinks, and clean bathrooms. So yeah, if you are in the coming down for Crybaby Hill, make sure to stop by and see us at Riverside Studio, also known as Tulsa Spotlight Theater.
And for someone that's, you know, my first year to miss it in a long time, those are things you really want to take advantage of. Clean bathrooms, air conditioning, and cold drinks, because a lot of the times, you know, we're drinking on the back of a cop car, and
That has been known to happen.
It's an epic
And
photo.
those porta potties at the top of the hill. Oh my God, that's horrible.
Yeah, that's you got to be a younger individual than I.
Fair enough.
But speaking of the river, one last thing that's right outside the spotlight, you're going to be having the raft race, and as
Yes.
we mentioned, the big dam party, which I assume is going to include more than just the raft. I assume there's other events that just haven't been announced yet.
Yeah, no, it is huge. So, you know, the big one, oh gosh, there are so many. I couldn't say what was the big one. So it's all in recognition of the opening of, quote, Zinc Lake. So the low water dam, and we'll talk about the low water
reopening.
dams, and yes, reopening finally. But we'll talk about, you know, some of the changes over time. But the new low water dam is complete. They did go ahead and close it. So water is now at the level that it should be and will be maintained at that level as you go north from the gathering place. Also on that weekend, the new pedestrian bridge will be open. We'll go ahead and tell you, since this will probably be recorded or this will be published afterwards, but I'll be on the bridge tomorrow. So really excited to take my first steps on the new pedestrian bridge. There's a kayak course that will be opening there on the Arkansas River. Lots of improvements to the River Parks trails right there. Hanson will be playing at at the gathering place. You know, I'm a huge Hanson guy, so really looking forward to that, as well as the raft race. Everything should be open down in Riverview, which includes what has been known as Blue Rose. Not sure what's going to happen. I hear some things, and I don't want to say too much. Word on the street is kind of thing, so I don't know. But we actually were by there earlier today, and they have areas blocked off as they are making some improvements in parking. The old playground area was actually taken out, but I have seen the plans and they'll put a new one in. So, yeah, all of those things in conjunction with Labor Day. Again, that's when the drillers become the raft racers and the return of the great raft race on the Arkansas River.
So yeah, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to, really see the river for the first time and think that it happened overnight, and that's why we're down there celebrating. But this really was a long struggle, decade struggle to have a river that we see today. And that's our topic today. And of course, there's been plenty of focus on the river, latest developments, as we've mentioned. But we'll talk a little bit more about the history of the river and how our past ideas for the river have influenced our present reality.
The fact that Tulsa is here is because of the river. Like many cities, not only in the United States, throughout the world, the river, was used not only as a water source, it was used as transportation. And so, yes, we are where we are because of the Arkansas River.
And it has some interesting history, especially here in Tulsa. Over the decades, Tulsa's mayors have called it the greatest natural resource, but this river goes way beyond the city limits of Tulsa and the state lines. It actually runs a total of almost 1,500 miles. It's America's sixth longest, 45th longest in the world. And guess how much miles is in Oklahoma?
Like Route 66. We'll claim most of it.
Yeah,
because it actually drops into Oklahoma from Kansas. It does have kind of a weird path as it makes its way from Leadville, Colorado. This river, this Prairie River we have here in Tulsa, actually has its origins in the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, so that totals 327.9 miles in Oklahoma, and it's always changing though. So those numbers are they seem a little more exact maybe than they are, because it is again a prairie river, very sandy, very sediments of all sorts. And I think it's most like you mentioned, the source of it in Leadville up in the Rocky Mountains, what they consider the upper portion of it, descends nearly 10,000 feet in just 125 miles.
Oh, wow, that is moving.
So, yeah, and you can imagine it's a little more filtered at that time, so a little cleaner from the start of it. And
it makes for some great whitewater rafting.
Yeah, the whitewater rafting in those areas, are just, some of the best in Colorado and maybe even beyond. It's not necessarily a sport that I have really experimented with, but also I haven't experimented with the exceptional trout fishing that's up there as well. But one thing I have been to is the Royal Gorge out there, and I remember taking a trip with my family when I was younger, and it was pretty crazy. I didn't know we would be talking about it in this episode. It
is hard to believe
that
is the same body of water.
Yeah. But like we said, this Prairie River is in constant flux.
So I don't know if we've talked about my background as an environmentalist. I was senior environmental monitor here in the city of Tulsa. We'll talk about that when we talk about the floods. But my original degree was in wildlife and fisheries management. So, I've been able to look at this river from kind of a different perspective through the years. Then as I, moved from conservation of the natural environment to preservation of the built environment and the work that I do with Tulsa Foundation for Architecture, now Spotlight Theater, etc. But it's really interesting, the natural cycles of this river and how we have altered it in so many ways over the past couple of 100 years, because it is all dependent on the spring rains, and specifically the snow melt. We don't think about snow melt in Colorado, but as it coming off the Rockies, that's why April through June are the times when that river is at its highest. That's whenever we have floods or threats of floods. And then by late summer into fall, with the drier condition and droughts that are common in this part of the United States, you and I have, and many others have, just simply walked across the river.
Yeah, and I mean, we're dealing with flooding almost every night this week, flood warnings and different things that have been happening just from the amount of rain this time of year as well. But the river is pretty high right now, like you were saying. It's June right now, but the river goes through other large cities, so I'm sure it's pretty high there as well. Wichita, Kansas was one of the bigger ones, and then, of course, Little Rock. Tulsa's vision to dam the river goes back really for decades, and however many problems have arisen over time, it continues to be an issue. Everything from water quality to the impact of the natural processes downstream. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that history, and we'll discuss the ambitious developments that have been proposed over the years, as well as the ones that are upcoming. And we'll reminisce on past times we had on the river ourselves in this episode of the Tulsa Times podcast. So yeah, we start these episodes in chronological order, and sometimes that means going all the way back to the beginning. So 29 million years ago, let's go, the Arkansas River Valley is formed, and the path has changed over those years and carved stone and shaped really the landscape from Colorado to Arkansas.
That's one of those signature characteristics of this prairie style of river. We talk about carving through stone up in the Rocky Mountains. That's what gives it a lot of the salt. So as it comes down and erodes that limestone, that's where it's picking up a lot of those salts. Then it flows through the prairies of southern Kansas, northern Oklahoma, picking up more sediment. Really, most of that sediment comes from the Cimarron. The Cimarron River hooks up with the Arkansas just on the other side of Sand Springs, just west of Sand Springs, basically where the Keystone Dam is today. But it's those powerful snow melts when you have all that water coming down at one time that you mentioned how the number of miles that we count that the Arkansas River has changed, because the river itself literally changes. It changes its course and its paths and will redirect to a certain area, making these oxbow lakes, cutting off certain sections of the river as it changes and moves throughout time.
And it's really that sediment that really created the platform that Tulsa's really on, And not only that, but, the fertile soil that's south of Tulsa in the Bixby area. And that's where, we had native tribes that lived along the river for thousands of years. Mound builders, the Caddo, Wichita, Osage. And what's interesting about the Wichita, it was the Lastly Vore site, which was discovered in 1988. And that's just 13 miles south of Tulsa, and it's a Wichita village that supposedly are estimated around 6,000 people that overlooked the river.
Yeah, that's, we can relate to that area now because it's basically 131st and Yale. So where the river is taking that bend as we are going over towards Bixby was this village of, they estimate upwards of 6,000 people. That's really tough to tell because there were no permanent structures. The Wichita people in this part of the state lived in these circular structures made of grass. So we don't find any remaining structures. What we do find of their habitat is a lot of artifacts because there are various storage pits, like 80 different pits that were found. Many of them were used for storage. Some were trash. And it's amazing how these trash piles from these older civilizations is just a wealth of information for us. We've got some fire pits that were discovered. So we know that there was a substantial population of Wichita in the Tulsa area, immediate Tulsa area, dating back hundreds of years at this point, at least a few hundred years.
And, not only that, but confirmation from French explorers that wrote about it in 1719. And, those have kind of come together. John Baptiste Bernard La Harpe. And he's the one that's actually credited with the name, creating Little Rock, the name. But he stayed at the Wichita Lastly Vor site for 10 days at least. And he said, there were various Wichita sub-tribes that were there. And so it was kind of like this, place where everybody kind of came, kind of the main meeting point of all these people that are living along the river. So that's the French explorers. But before that, we had explorers from Spain. So the Spanish explorers, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, 1514. And they called the Arkansas River at the time St. Peter's and St. Paul's River. And there's also evidence of Rio Napeste, and I'm probably not saying my Spanish correctly. And then we had Hernando de Soto, who was the first European to explore the river, and that was actually in the same year, 1541. And so then we had those French explorers that I mentioned earlier, La Harpe, and again stayed here along the river. So
yeah, that Lastly Vor site is really interesting, and it's interesting how in the 1700s and how De La Harpe stayed here with them in this area. So those visits by Europeans to what was the Wichita settlement at what is now known as the Lastly Vor site, it was those explorers that really helped to lead to the downfall of that population, with over 6,000 people that were estimated to be in that settlement and in that general area. By 100 years later, that settlement had been completely abandoned. In fact, the tribes that made up that settlement, those over 6,000 people, there was less than 1,000 of them by the time that they, number one, were wiped out by European diseases that they had no immunity to. And as Eastern tribes moved in the United States, they were forced westward into Oklahoma.
Yeah, and La Harpe, when he stayed there, there's quite a bit of documentation, but he said that he saw a Chickasaw trader, and that concerned him because they dealt with the British. So, we had a lot of kind of influences, and when they were all in this melting pot, it just, led to exactly what you're talking about. But back to the Arkansas River real quick, the Quapaw lived and hunted along the banks as well. And some say that the name Arkansas was derived from them and eventually carried westward, where Zebulon Pike, of course, Pike's Peak, was on the river and more of the upper portion, if you will.
One of my favorite explorers is an American, Washington Irving, the noted early American author. Rip Van Winkle, one of my favorites, Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So not only was he a writer, he was a historian, he was a biographer, wrote the biography of George Washington, and for our purposes here, he was a travel writer.
And he met George Washington, actually. So when he was younger, he got a chance to meet him and then wrote the biography on him later. But just to give some dates on those books, Rip Van Winkle, we still know it today, 1819, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, 1820. And so we'll jump forward a little bit. 1832 is when he was visiting this area, or about to visit this area, actually. He was a chance encounter with one of the commissioners who was a part of the removal of the tribes west of the Mississippi and appointed by Andrew Jackson. And once they met, just by chance, he jumped at the opportunity to join him exploring this territory, and not only that, but writing about it. And so when they're venturing south, or I guess southwest, they meet with William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame, who was at the time Indian Affairs Superintendent, to get the direction and also, just suggestions on how to deal with certain things along exploring paths. This is not an explorer, but he's listening to one of the more famed explorers. But of course, Fort Gibson would have been kind of this introduction, this entranceway into the area that they were about to explore. And so in 1832, later that year, the month-long exploration began in present-day Oklahoma, which he wrote about in the book Tour of the Prairies, which still is in print, still can be found, first published in 1835, and has never been out of print, like I said.
So you can, and people have followed the path of that adventure that he went on from Fort Gibson. Fort Gibson was a great starting place because that's where the Arkansas River joins with both the Neosho and Verdigris. So it is easy to get boats all the way up the Arkansas River from the Mississippi River to that point. So it was in 1824 that the fort was built there. It was primarily to number one, keep white people out of the Indian territories. That's why Fort Smith is located right on the Arkansas-Oklahoma border as well. But it was the westernmost American settlement in 1824. And it's hard to believe because, we think about Tulsa and even Oklahoma as being relatively young cities and states, but this area and the documentation of this area goes back to 1824. So we're talking about, less than 20 years after the Lewis and Clark exploration. So that's less than 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was the first settlement here in Oklahoma.
And so in Tour of the Prairies, like you said, people were traveling along this path, and one of the paths is near here in Tulsa, actually over in the Owen Park area. There's still a monument there today, and he writes about camping there and overlooking this river. The area that they were exploring was really just a survey of the territory because the government knew little about it, but they were about to remove a lot of tribes. In fact, 39 different nations were removed to present-day Oklahoma.
Yeah, there are portions of the book that we can very specifically identify where he was, Washington Irving, when he came through in the 1830s. There's a monument over off the Arkansas River Bridge near 141st and Memorial. And, of course, for me and Riverview, the area that we now call the McBurney Springs, just downhill from the McBurney Mansion. There are a series of springs along that ridge we now call Crybaby Hill, but he describes stopping at that specific spring there at Houston and Riverside Drive. And of course, you mentioned camping up in the Owen Park area, and there's a monument to Washington Irving that was placed there in the neighborhood in 1915.
And you can learn more about that at Tulsa Past Instagram. I have some of that pictures there.
Of course you do. You've got all the good stuff. So also in the Riverview neighborhood, which I consider to be the oldest neighborhood in Tulsa, despite what the Owen Park residents have to say about it, because it was that stretch of the Arkansas River that the Lochapoka settled when they arrived here. They are a band or a tribe of the Muskogee Nation, and during the forced relocation of the tribes, the Lochapoka did settle here in what would become Tulsa there at the Council Oak Tree.
And that council oak tree is 350 plus years old, is estimated to be. And again, that was their main site for tribal meetings, ceremonies, and stickball, which still happens there from time to time. There is still kind of some recreation there for that.
So the post oak is a very unique tree. It's a very long-lived species. Now, they usually don't get very large. We had two exceptional specimens here in the Tulsa area, the most noted being that council oak tree. So I mentioned the springs along that ridge, and it is that underground, natural, clean water that is constantly supplied to that oak, which has kept it as healthy as it is. Now, the other large post oak tree that many of us are familiar with was the hanging tree. And the hanging tree, it was what, last year? Was it during that June storm, that Father's Day storm of last year, that we lost the hanging tree? But the hanging tree was also a very old post oak.
So from that hill in 1834, they could have seen a steamboat passing through. William Parsons, who made it up the mouth of the Cimarron River, now the Keystone Lake area, with supplies for Camp Arbuncle, which was a new army post at the time. And so, that steamboat recreation, commerce, 1840s, 1860s, followed by the Civil War and then eventually railroads. But it's interesting because, you see you're fighting against the river flow, if there is any. People are having to use a lot of antiquated devices in order to move these steamboats, even pushing it with sticks into the dirt and then, walking it along the deck, which wasn't unusual. But yeah, we also got to keep in mind there was a little bit more water in the river at the time. But again, it's one of those prairie rivers with a lot of fluctuations. But the negatives about the river is obviously that it flooded with more water being in it. It was unfit for bathing, drinking, or even cooking with. Smelled.
Certainly that the primary reason for it being unfit for drinking was because of the salt content, both salt and sediment. The sediment, is a little easier to filter out or remove. And so, even though we are here on the sandy banks of the Arkansas River, we could not use that as a drinking source without it, really a lot of energy going into it. I mentioned the springs. So the springs around here are fresh, clean groundwater. And so even though we have this great water source, what do they say? Water everywhere and not a drop to drink. We had to dig wells to obtain water. Then the whole sewage and industry thing came later. This is a product of unregulated businesses, specifically refineries, and we'll talk more about some of the consequences of that later. But I do want to give credit to Holly Frontier, now Sinclair HF, for putting in a lot of work to clean up areas near the Arkansas River. Not their practices specifically, but this is all remnants of when it was an unregulated industry and they just did whatever they pleased with their waste.
The early days researching some of the river, there was actually shanty boat dwellers that hung out along Riverside area and
the tent cities. Yeah. So one of my favorite Tulsans, Lon Stansberry, really interesting fellow, but he and his family came from Missouri to participate in the land run of 1889. Somehow they were not lucky, didn't get a parcel of land, so they were on their way back to Missouri. They stopped in Tulsa, camped on the banks of the Arkansas River when his mother found out about the Presbyterian mission and what a great school they had. So instead of going all the way back to Missouri, she just decided that the family would stay right there, and they camped on the banks of the Arkansas River until they could find housing. He went on to become a very influential socialite here in Tulsa.
And some of the positives about camping near the river in its earliest days, it's said to have a lot of wild walnut trees that were scattered throughout the area. And it was really one of Tulsa's first industries was the walnuts, and followed by, there were a lot of fish at the time. So fish were plentiful, catfish in the earliest days, but less survived over time, due to people dumping waste and just living near the river and, what it takes to do that. And then, recreation of sorts existed. People were using boats, rowing, steam, gasoline, and sailboats because the water was higher, like I mentioned. It would be more friendly to travel than it is.
So that alteration of the water levels not only comes from that natural process, but we're now talking about the point where we see direct human impacts. So it was during this period that farmers in Kansas began digging irrigation canals. So much of the water that was normally flowing into the Arkansas when it was navigable, when there was more water in it, that water was now being diverted in Kansas to supply water to farms in southern Kansas.
And so, Tulsa never really drank from this water. Like you said, they already had kind of wells of sorts, but they had a water franchise that came. Some of it came from the Arkansas River. I assume it was filtered at this point. I don't know how. It didn't really go into detail in the news article, but they did say it was mainly mud. So, I mean, it wasn't that great to drink to begin with. But by 1908, the city took over and started drilling deep wells near Newbach Park. So that's actually kind of where one of the levees are today. And we're going to go into that here pretty shortly, too. But one interesting thing that I found along the way was Tulsa Democrat, which is later the Tulsa Tribune, used the water from the river to run their presses. So this would have been a water press, and water that was muddy left the paper dim, which was hard to read. But if the water was clearer, then the paper was so inky that it was hard to read. So it was just hard to read. And looking back on some of these articles, I mean, they are a little tough to read if you can find them. But what was interesting, people were still using the water no matter what condition it was in. Baptisms took place in the river, and it reminds me of a scene of, "Oh brother, where art thou?"
Oh, indeed. Yep.
And to book in that, the religious aspects of thinking that the river is our greatest natural resource and that it should be utilized and controlled by us, which we'll go into greater detail, but it just goes against the natural way of thinking. It affects the wildlife. The river's just bigger than us. It goes beyond Tulsa, Oklahoma, even further. And what affects us also affects everyone else too. And so travel, for instance, getting across this river, it was an impediment to travel initially. But what was interesting, there's a natural land bridge that was used. And it's basically a limestone formation about 300 million years old, and that's just right up the street from you, 11th Street Bridge.
Yeah, we could see it. I have not been across the tracks and over into the Crosby Heights neighborhood since they closed the low water dam. I'm not sure that we can see, what we commonly refer to as Gano's Crossing. So it was that limestone ledge, that was a part of the Osage Trail, became known as Gano's Crossing during the Civil War. Confederate General Gano used that. And then once the railroad came to Tulsa, and Tulsa was really a cow town in its beginnings, that's where cattlemen would drive the cattle across the Arkansas River to the railhead in Tulsa to deliver then those cattle to Kansas City.
And around that same time, that's when the ferry across was available for certain people. But it was very slow, very unreliable, and I couldn't find any positives, actually, about the ferry that was there for a short amount of time.
Yeah, there are lots of complaints by people that tried to use the ferry from that time.
So that brings us to bridges over the river. 1904 is the non-railroad bridge, and this is a toll bridge that had to be created after a failed bond issue. It might sound familiar. But that was the wagon bridge near 11th Street, and it had this sign on it that you'll read if you go back and research it at all. It said, "They said we couldn't do it, but we did." And so the toll bridge was like that for a number of years until the city eventually bought it and was used as not a toll bridge, but as a public bridge around statehood. So
yeah, that's interesting that, it was a failed bond issue, because that will be a recurring theme as we talk about development of the river. Many failed bond issues, some of them justifiably because some of these ideas were absolutely horrible or ridiculous, but it's thanks to private enterprise or philanthropy. Gathering Place right there on the river, great example. That was not funded through taxpayer money. That was privately funded. Of course, George Kaiser providing, at least half of the money for that facility. And it's philanthropy. It is people going out and doing it. They said it couldn't be done, but we did it.
Company named Midland Valley made a railroad bridge, 29th and Riverside, in 1915, and then 60 years later was used for public use when the first pedestrian bridge opened.
The first pedestrian bridge, yes, the one that many people will miss, came down just, I think it was last year.
Yeah,
that
it was
as they
very
were
recent.
building the new pedestrian bridge. And that's one of those things. I heard a lot of complaints, a lot of people very unhappy about the loss of that bridge, which I totally understand. I have had many great experiences, a lot of fun on the old bridge, a lot of memories. I'm looking forward to a lot of memories on the new bridge.
And there was a lot of memories made along the Cyrus Avery Bridge as Route 66 crossed that. It was built much earlier, though. The interurban tracks even went on it for a number of years until being removed in the 30s. And it actually was redesigned and updated with more of an Art Deco look in 1929.
You mentioned Cyrus Avery is just, critical to the development of Tulsa. He was county commissioner, I believe was his title, in 1917 when the county built that first bridge, the now 11th Street Bridge, which was eventually the Route 66 bridge. And it's because of that bridge and then Cyrus Avery's later influence in the Route 66 Commission or in the Highway Commission that ensured that Route 66 came through Tulsa using that bridge to his bridge to cross over the Arkansas River.
And then there's a few other bridges, of course, the 51st Street Bridge and then the Jinx Bridge. 1930s, there was kind of a joke that I read talking about they should just pave the river and make it a speedway in itself. So,
There you go.
Yeah,
Yes.
so,
Hey, some of the other ideas that have come up with, that's probably one of the better of them.
yeah. So if it was a speedway, that would prevent the flooding that happened, maybe. But yeah, the floods that have happened. It's 19 feet is the flood stage, and some of our earliest floods that we are documented were 1880s, and that would have been seen by the tribes overlooking the hill. And then later, around statehood, 1908. Is when we see another huge flood. And then the precedent that we lived by for a number of years, 1923, and that was the record flood of 22.8 feet. That mainly affected the west side of the river, which had a lower population at that time. But, of course, there was oil work happening on that side of the river, as well as the refinery that was getting set up in that whole area. Downtown Jinx, actually, they said main business district was under 8 feet of water in 1923.
That's amazing.
And then in part due to that, that's when we start to see the levees planned, and that begins 1935 and through the 1940s. But the Corps of Engineers are obviously the ones that started that, and there's 3 sand levees, all built to protect the neighborhoods and, of course, the refining facilities. Levee A, where Sand Springs Levee, that's the heavily industrial area up the river, of course, upstream. Levee B, which is around New Block Park, and then Levee C, and this you can see maps of this, of course, online, refinery areas and the PSO. And PSO actually uses some of that water flow to cool some of their things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit. But 19 total miles of levees that were finished in 1945, and that's 8 miles on the north bank of the river, 11 on the south bank.
That's interesting, because depending on where you are in Tulsa County, whether it's the north and south bank or the east and the west bank, it does take that turn towards the south, where most people know it, right there between New Block Park and the Crosby Heights neighborhood. But those levees, as you mentioned, they're sand levees. It is just fill. There's not like a concrete wall, anything like that holding back the water. And that 2019 flood event, and that flood event lasted for almost a month, and that really tested those 70-year-old levees.
And I think we're happy that it is sand, because I think concrete from the 1940s would be long gone by now anyway. But speaking of that, 1949 levees constructed to protect Jinx is really tested in the next precedent flood in 86, which most people that are around today will remember the 86 flood if they were here in town.
A series of them in the mid-'80s. 84 was another really big one that affected Brookside.
But other notable ones that affected, direct developments was 57, and this was Brookside was just freshly kind of a neighborhood, and it was damaged by a flood in 57. And top 5 worst was 1959, 2 years later at 22 feet. So that's one of the top 5, like I said, worst. But that brings us to where the Keystone Dam was completed. That would have been 1964. So we're slowly moving forward. And the Keystone Dam was a huge accomplishment for its time.
Yeah, flood control. While it does produce a little bit of electricity, it's almost inconsequential. That dam is really there to protect Tulsa.
And the biggest flood, it controlled the flood waters for a number of years until really 1986, when it tested everything that we've known. It was an overnight flood, kind of came out of nowhere, eventually reached 25.5 feet, which is today's flood standard. Again, 19 feet is the flood stage.
Imagine.
1993, flood damage to areas along the river. So, yeah, a lot of people that were in town will remember the 2019 flood, and that really tested the levees that are now decades old. It did $7.2 million in damages at the gathering place alone due to it being on that, that corner there. And then, of course, the Arkansas River became the largest casino pool in Tulsa,
yes, it did.
which the chlorine mixed with the mud and kind of created a whole new. I'm glad no one got inside of it.
That was the year of the party at the sinkhole.
Yeah, the sinkhole was happening around that same time.
Oh my gosh, there was some craziness because it lasted for so long. Again, that event lasted for almost a month. And everybody was watching the numbers of what was being discharged from Keystone, because unlike those 80s events, so the floods in the 80s were primarily due to localized rainfall. There was significant rain dumped in a very short amount of time, overwhelming the stormwater system, while that 2019 one was all about rainfall and snow melt upstream, upriver from Tulsa. So it was getting backed up against that now, 70-year-old dam at Keystone. And they just had to open those gates and just let it flow out. But after the 1980s, the city of Tulsa took its stormwater very, very seriously. A lot of we see some of the new soccer fields that are, lower than the street level, because those are catch basins. In the event of a flood, water is going to fill those soccer fields. So it's not going to do any damage to the fields. And that was just one of the things. A lot of new underground pipelines that were put in to handle all of the city stormwater so that it wouldn't get backed up the way that it did back in the 80s. I don't know that a flood the magnitude of the 80s, certainly not caused by localized rainfall, can never happen again because of all of the work done by the folks in the stormwater department at the city of Tulsa.
And of course, we have to keep in mind that there will be future floods. And so the so-called 100-year storm event were to happen, it is a possibility that it could destroy the aging levees. But like what had just happened this past week.
Yeah, it was just this past week that the state of Oklahoma approved and allocated $50 million for levee repair. Much credit to our county commissioner, Karen Keith, for pushing this through, working not only with the state legislature, but with our federal representatives as well, because the federal government is kicking in additional $140 million. So we have almost $200 million to put to levee repair. In 2019, we figured out that we needed it. I spent, and this was amongst my last days as senior environmental monitor for the city, spent a lot of time up on those levees with the sheriff, National Guard. We had huge, massive pumps because that water was at that high level for so long that with those sand levees, that water was just seeping through. And so then it had to be pumped back into the Arkansas. And it was always a question about, are we keeping up? Because that west side of Tulsa along Charles Page was very, very much in danger. I remember many times driving out of the Charles Page area, and you go up that hill there on 3rd Street by where Belafonte is now. And once you get to the top of the hill, you can breathe easy knowing you are out of that danger zone. Because if one of those levees had breached, all of that area of that Charles Page neighborhood would have been underwater instantly.
And yeah, that's what's interesting. I know, the city's kind of preparing for the worst case scenario in whatever situation. And it was interesting to see some of the research of that literally the worst case scenario would be the Keystone Dam failing and where that water would end up. And there's maps of this and where certain places could be within the floodplain, but the floodplain's still being developed on because a lot of people kind of become unaware that the worst case scenario is still possible. And there's a lot of evidence of this. In fact, there's still really big concerns about the river in general because of the people that are living within that area and the probability that it will flood again. I mean, it's kind of inevitable. But I want to give a quick shout out to an investigative journalist named Molly Bullock, who has a Substack page just about this subject, and it's called Watershed, and really uncovers kind of broader issues that we're facing as a city in regards to the Arkansas River. Just want to say some great research, and this is where some of this information brought me to talk a little bit about this in this episode. But yeah, definitely check that out. But now we're going to move forward to Tulsa's control and use of the water, which is kind of the recreation part of this. So it's going to get a little more fun and a little less scientific. But as long as people have lived near the river, of course, we've had dreams of what could be possible. And some of those dreams over the years have been pretty interesting to go back and look at. Ideas for the river recreation introduced as early as 1940s at least, and the overall concept was first and still kind of has been to put water in the river.
Yeah,
So,
maintaining that prairie river because people think it looks ugly, it's disgusting, it smells bad in the late summer, fall when it does naturally dry up. Again, I guess with my background, I have an appreciation for that. And I appreciate the changing dynamics of the river, but a lot of people want water in the river, period. And for recreation and tourism purposes, I get it. And so, yeah, lots of grand ideas, some of them that have come to fruition, some of them that we just scratch our head. What were these people thinking?
and we can go back to the origins of this. Completed the levees, of course, 1940s, 1950s is when this riverfront park idea really becomes popular. I mean, of course, keep in mind people have been living along the river, but this is kind of more from a recreation perspective. And the city begins acquiring some of this land from 11th to 51st. And 1960, the city engineers began looking at dams and found flaws in the single dam design, and instead went with this series of low water dams for a number of reasons, which I won't really get into great detail, but kind of control and also quality. And but long story short, at this same time, we had a lot of riverfront beautification happening, and that was when the Keystone Dam was put in to really control, in a lot of people's mind, the flood mitigation systems, and it led to developments that were possible downstream.
Yeah, those early 60s ideas, again, river parks and the trails as we know them today just did not exist back then. So there was a plan, I believe it was a 1959 plan for central Tulsa that talked about the near downtown riverfront development. And this was the origins of river parks trails, and their idea was what they called the marina. So in 1959 they first proposed that, well, they called it a floating restaurant. We eventually did get something similar because they were talking about by the 21st Street Bridge, and of course we now have what's formerly known as the Blue Rose. So it took decades, 50 years to get there, but we did get it. But they had all kinds of great ideas. There was going to be a boat club, picnic islands built out there, some that you could get to by a bridge, some you would have to have a boat to get out to these islands where they would have picnic areas, cabana bars, all of those kind of things. Very, very different than what actually came to be. Fortunately, a lot of the good things that were mentioned in this first plan have eventually taken shape.
And that plan was a bond issue that was put before the city in the 60s. River Lakes Park is what it was called, and it was a 50-year development program. But we also have to keep in mind it's the mid-20th century, and of course, access was everything, and ambition, and so on. We were heading to the moon just in a few years. But River Lakes Park was conceptualized with these series of low water dams, like I was saying, and creating really three small lakes, which would include three dams. And one was at the original bend of the river, kind of up in your neighborhood, one at 35th Street, and another one at 81st Street Bridge. So, but what was interesting...
There is no 81st Street Bridge. So, yeah, those things that do come. Now, they did eventually build that bridge at 96, which is now we know it as the Jinx Bridge.
Yeah. I think what was most interesting about these dams was that they were rubberized and reinforced with inflatable nylon fabric and shaped into tubes. And so this isn't unusual to what's happening at Swan Lake right now. They're moving water in a specific area, but this would have been on a much larger scale.
Yeah, for sure.
But
interesting. Wow. I wonder how that worked functionally. Because, the low water dam that eventually went in the 70s, failed, 20 years later or so.
Yeah, it was very...
Couldn't be much worse than that. But they did eventually, and from what I understand, this plan from 1960 was a 50-year plan. And if you look over the 50 years between 1960 and, say, 2010, a lot of those things eventually did come to fruition.
Not only were the three small lakes part of this 50-year plan, but the recreation and entertainment of all kinds. So they had the idea for a marinas actually, that were boating, canoeing, sailing, fishing, and then parks, which kind of are along the path today but weren't there then. Tunnel walkways underneath Riverside Drive, which sounds like a nightmare, especially for...
we do have the one... on the Crow Creek that does go under.
The plan also had an idea for a golf course and 3 amphitheaters, so not just one that we eventually had, but 3, and they wanted these located at 49th West on the north side, 18th Street on the east side, and 71st Street on the east side. And not only that, but they wanted a amusement park, a downtown amusement park, as well as a museum along the river. So this was all part of that plan. The most ambitious of all was the shopping and recreation center known as Pier 15. And this is really interesting, especially reading about it at the time. It was patterned after the 12th century old London Bridge, and pedestrian walkways was basically the main thing, but we also had specialty shops, boutiques, sidewalk cafes, and restaurants of sorts that were on this bridge. So it was a pedestrian bridge, but with everything included. In September of 1969, the bond issue failed, though, reaching only 41%. However, a lot of those ideas from the ambitious plan lived on, and there was another bond issue that included a lot of those things, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But one thing that's really important is the port of Catoosa. The Kerr-McClellan navigation system, which was only a few years after that first bond issue, and that's when you start to see the first barges arriving. In the same year, that was the attempt that they tried to make the Arkansas River a national park system in order to receive federal grants. So the national park, the idea was a long-range concept, 10 to 15 years, but to make that area a national park, which is kind of interesting. But back to the parks, river parks in the 1970s, more land was being purchased, 1973. And this is, again, using some of those same ideas from the failed bond issue, but they wanted to add even more to it. They wanted waterfalls alongside the river in certain places, and they wanted to put a cable car over the river, which when I read that, I was thinking, that's
something.
That's where our sky ride could have went today, gathering place could have.
Right. There you
but
go.
I don't think the sky ride met qualification or at least up-to-date standards.
True. You saw what they did to the old pedestrian bridge.
Yeah.
Don't give them the sky ride.
And then around this same time, again, while River Parks was being developed, they had an idea, Gateway Park, and this was along Houston Street coming from the Civic Center downtown to the river.
Yes.
And that would have been...
No.
Yeah.
Only because it is so narrow, and this has been talked about a lot, and I take this personally, because we're talking about Houston, which is that small street that is between Riverside Studio and the McBurney Mansion. They would affect not only the studio, they would have to take out the spring that was mentioned in that 1835 Washington Irving book. Just a lot of damage to the neighborhood, to Riverview, to be able to do that. One of those that I am so glad that didn't happen.
Yeah, I'm glad that it didn't happen either, but things did still occur, not that particularly, but, pedestrian walkways and bike paths were planned. And 1973, that same year, the Great Raft Race first began. And just a year later was the River Parks Authority is established. So that's the birth of River Parks.
Yeah, so this is where we start to see things actually happening that we get to take advantage of today. So it's the 50th anniversary of the Tulsa River Parks Authority. And so again, we take it for granted, assume that it's always been the case, that we have those great paths, the river parks trails, but that was not a thing until the 70s. Really excited to have the Great Raft Race back this year after, because it would be celebrating its 50th anniversary as well, at least from the first one. So it's the 1970s where things not only start being implemented, but we see the transformation of what was just this wild sandy riverbank into the opportunities for recreation that we have today.
So a year after the River Parks Authority is established is when the Midland Valley Railroad Bridge renovation happens for the pedestrian use. And what's interesting, this was actually partially funded by the Tulsa Tribune Bridge Fund campaign. So this was basically done through the newspaper.
Sure, yeah, they did the fundraiser.
Partially.
Said, hey, come, donate some money, and the people of the city of Tulsa, as always, again, we have this great tradition of philanthropy. Instead of trying to pass a bond issue, just ask the people to make a donation. $5, $10. Tribune put in enough money that they did a significant portion of the funding to convert that old Midland Valley Railroad Bridge to the pedestrian bridge that we all knew and loved for so long.
And you said we couldn't do it, but we did. And then a year later, that's when we have the Arkansas Sandcastle contest. So if you see the cover of this episode, that's where that picture comes from. 1976, they had a sandcastle building competition, basically. Different versions, and there's quite a few photos of this on the Tulsa Historical Society website. But Ding, ding, ding. Round two, bond issue round two.
Hey.
1975 is when they started kind of moving around for this. Now that they have some infrastructure along river parks and an authority. So their second chance to fund development along the river through a bond issue was considered again, and very reminiscent of that initial River Lakes Park plan from less than a decade before. But this time, a 15-year plan versus the 50-year plan, and they wanted to add a planetarium. They wanted to keep the marina. They wanted to just have one amphitheater instead of three. They still wanted the restaurants, shops, retail, stuff like that. They also wanted to add a hotel, which is interesting because there's a huge casino hotel at the end of the river now. But housing developments, which are very prominent along the river as well. I lived in one of them myself. A lighted fountain of sorts. That's very vague. I think that could basically be anything. A lighted fountain.
Right. Well, we did have that fountain there by the pedestrian bridge, by the former low water dam,
And
hadn't functioned in, I don't know,
well, I think
10 or more years
the
by
new
the time they took it out.
pedestrian bridge is lit up of sorts.
It is, yes. I see it occasionally in the mornings. It's all
Oh, okay.
LED lights. They do different colors, different patterns. So, yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun.
And so this bond issue was continued, of course, campaigned for a while. And then in 79, they added even more to this plan, the Science Museum, which was just a museum and an amusement park. But then the amphitheater again was not given up. People wanted it. Basically changed each time it was brought in. So it got bigger, got smaller, got medium size. But the commercial area on the bank, the West Bank, is really what they were trying to do. But again, the second chance at this river development via bond issue failed in 79. And then the development of Zinc Dam was put in motion by private and public funds, hence the name Zinc. So that's where the name Zinc comes from. And the Zinc Dam is not new. This is actually just the same name, but the newer version of it that the dam or that we see today. But the Zinc Dam was initially installed in the early 1980s, again named for the Zinc family who donated $1 million towards the dam's construction. And 1980s, that's what they called a low water dam.
Again, it's that 70s and 80s where, we really see progress to what we know today. Turkey Mountain was designated as an urban wilderness area in 1978. They've continued to buy land. The county has. It is a county park using their funds. Federal, again, private funds have been used to acquire land. They've gained an additional 500 acres since it was originally established in 1978. And then, of course, when you think about that area of the former amphitheater and that West Bank Festival grounds, immediately Oktoberfest comes to mind. So the first Oktoberfest was in 1979 as well. Now, they weren't over on that West Bank for a couple years later, but since 1981, Oktoberfest has been there on the banks of the Arkansas River at the West Bank Festival Park.
There were issues with water quality just like we have today. And some of this was, like we mentioned before, petroleum byproducts. And this was the Texaco refinery that was located there. High levels of bacteria, which comes from sewage that infiltrates the storm drains. And present day, the water quality dashboard, which you can view online, and that's up-to-date information about the water quality today. But as far as back then, it was a whole different story about, even testing wasn't up to the standards that we have today.
True, yeah, and I think it's really, while we continue to have concerns over water quality issues, it is nothing like it was back in the 80s. You sent me an article about when there was a large petroleum leak because they had been digging along the banks of the Arkansas River and were pulling up gasoline out of these wells that they were drilling, because there were containers that were buried along the riverbanks that nobody knew about. We had serious contamination issues with petroleum products because, again, it was largely unregulated for so very, very long. We are finally to the point, and those of us older folks will remember the distinct smell that you used to have in the Arkansas River, which is not there today. The improvements over the past 40 years have been very substantial in cleaning up specifically those petroleum byproducts. Yeah, it's always going to have issues with drainage because most of it comes from, at least, in the area when we look at the water immediately in the Tulsa area, because it's from the stormwater system. When people have trash, oil leaks, antifreeze leaks in their cars, well, that water runs off into the storm drain and there is no filtration. It does not go to a plant. That water goes directly into the river. So again, it's those human impacts that I'm not sure how we will ever get a complete control over the pollutants that go into the Arkansas. But again, much credit to Sinclair and Holly Frontier for doing a lot to clean up the residue, of the previous pollutants that were exposed into the river. And for the amount of bacteria, and a lot of people are specifically worried about E. coli. And I can tell you one of the challenges with E. coli and where to test and the methods for testing, because again, I come from a background as an environmental scientist, and when the river is as low as it has been for the past few years, as the Corps of Engineers has held back water because we had the new dam built over in the Charles Page area. I'm sorry, the new bridge built in the Charles Page area that connects that side of the river to Berry Hill. We have, of course, Gathering Place. We have the new low water dam. We have bridge construction. We had a couple of years ago, they redid the water treatment plant and the outflow there. So for years, the Army Corps of Engineers has been holding back water. So when we have the water that is left, it is both water that is more immediate runoff from the local area, and because it evaporates so quickly, you have a spike in both pollutants and bacteria. So if you think about it, as the water evaporates, then what is left is going to be a higher concentration of those pollutants, a higher concentration of those contaminants. So when the water level has been as low as it has been for the past, 8 years or so, when we talk about, closing Riverside Drive in 2015, construction of Gathering Place, etc. So certainly since 19, when they had to release, ever since that point 5 years ago, it has been very, very dry. So the numbers that you're going to see today are going to be significantly lower than they were a year ago, only because of that water that is now flowing again into Zinc Lake and the Arkansas River.
And that water quality dashboard is available online on the city website. But they say on the website as well, do not make any direct contact with the water, even though they are planning whitewater kayaking for the upcoming flume, basically low water flume, whitewater kayaking, paddle boating, rowing, and river surf, but not all out swimming. But we look over at the river and we always say it looks the same as it always did. There's nothing happening on it, but in the past there have been airboats that used to travel on it, as crazy as it sounds. And then even flashback to Labor Day 1983 when they dedicated the first Zinc Lake. And that was what was called Aqua Fest, a 4-day riverfront celebration that included the 10th anniversary of the raft race.
I like the title of Big Dam Party better.
Yeah, it's more modern, I guess. But at this time, they had a sailing regatta and what they called the Mayor's Cup Regatta, which was like a collegiate or collegiate rowing, excuse me. And then hot air balloons are even going around town. And get this, Leon Russell headlined the music portions with other forms of entertainment, all kinds of different things. I'm sure a sandcastle event somewhere along the river. And the Philharmonic played Disney movies with, get this, Goofy was here.
What? Goofy was here.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
And then a soccer game, PSO Soccer Complex. There was a game happening over there. And then, of course, we know the rugby field.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Tulsa Rugby Club versus the University of Kansas. So 1983, Aquafest, 4-day riverfront celebration.
Nice.
We'd be amiss if we didn't mention Rumble Fish, because that was in 82, and
Right.
you know there would have been a lot of activity. We think of Tulsa not really much happening in the 80s, but along the river there actually was a lot of things happening. So they filmed Rumble Fish, which was released in 83 again, 2 weeks after The Outsiders, but that really features the 21st Street Bridge,
and
a lot
underneath
of
the 21st
infrastructure, from that developed, underdeveloped area. But yeah, we definitely want to mention, obviously, Rumblefish was front and center with the river there. But following that, they wanted to continue recreation, but it just wasn't anything like that weekend. And in fact, there was a lot of issues with sediment building up. In fact, in a short amount of time, they wanted to dredge this. They even had people that would move the sand for free because they could use it.
to collect the sand. Yeah.
And so
from behind the low water dam.
So almost immediately after the labor, during 1983 to 1985, that's when sand dredging and these islands were created as kind of an alternative to just completely move the sand. And those islands are upstream, of course. You can still see them. There's some even foliage on some of them, I believe.
Yeah.
And but the sand accumulated way more than expected, and was thought to have have dredged every 5 to 6 years. But they realized that they were going to have to do that a lot more often.
It's not called the sandy banks of the Arkansas for nothing. And again, it's so much of that silt and other sediment that's coming in from the Cimarron River, which gets its start in the Raton Pass in New Mexico. So as it travels along basically the 37th parallel to make its way to joining the Arkansas River, it's picking up, everybody's familiar with that red dirt out in western Oklahoma. Oh, yeah, so much of that gets washed into the Cimarron, washed into the Arkansas River. When it's released from Keystone, it's going to settle wherever it can, and a low water dam, perfect place for it. Yeah, it builds up quickly.
And they were still trying to develop Riverside. They had stuff, but they wanted more. The aquarium was first considered, which, of course, we have the Oklahoma Aquarium now, further south in Jinx.
Yes. Oh, yeah, love it.
And the amphitheater, which finally opened in June of 1985 with a free show being Glenn Miller Orchestra. And then the first ticketed concert was Joan Baez with Arlo Guthrie. Do you remember any shows from out there particularly?
Oh, yeah, sure, I do. I was trying to think about it, and I don't remember who I saw. I remember a band called, I don't know. It was the 80s. I don't know.
He just remembers the feeling of being there and seeing downtown Tulsa in the background. Well, I don't necessarily remember any shows myself, although I do remember being there, like you were saying. But Weird Al played there in 2003. Bob Dylan is the reviews weren't great, but what Bob Dylan shows reviews are great. But he complained about the floating stage and bugs blowing into the wind into his mouth.
Nice.
That was not mine. That was the article. The review had that in the art, so I can't take credit for that.
That's going to happen. Bugs blowing in the wind right into Bob Dylan's mouth.
And Leon Russell, of course, played there. Merle Haggard, B.B. King, and others. In fact, there was even kind of a recap of some of the things. There were some interesting things here. In 1986, River Parks officials hired a company to monitor the sound levels. Okay. And they actually did a $1,000 per minute surcharge for bands that exceeded 116 decibels. So they had people
$1,000 per minute?
Per minute surcharge. And so that was controlled by a company that just monitored the sound levels nearby. In 1997, Sponge was the band. A vocalist was jailed on 12 complaints of using the F word on stage. And this sounds a little antiquated, and that's because it is. It originally was a 1910 state law against obscene language in public. And get this, he spent 3 hours in jail.
Wow.
So,
that is kind of a thing, though, because we're talking about on the floating amphitheater, which, you can hear from the other side of the river. You can hear from the neighborhoods in the area. So,
I'm
interesting.
curious if he got $1,000 fine on top of that. If he said the F word too loud, it was $1,000 worth of. So it's 3 hours in jail and a few hours or a few $1,000. But one other band, 1999, Collective Soul, was 5 songs into their set when the lead singer was hit with a Zippo lighter square in the head.
Oh, yes. I remember that. I didn't realize that was Collective Soul. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And I guess that made the rounds. People must have heard about that one. But he said that he wasn't upset. He eventually kind of got over it. But they did end the set early, as you can imagine.
Right. Yeah.
But the final tally, I don't know how many concerts, but it was a very active place. But it was eventually sold in 2014 for only $550.
Right, because nobody wanted it. Because what are you going to do with it?
It was auctioned off, not sold.
It was
auctioned for $550.
I remember it very well. And the poor young lady that purchased it thought it was so cool to own a piece of Tulsa history. And then the city was like, all right, come get it out of here.
Yeah, where's
the
$50,000 to move it? Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so actually their first thing was, okay, it's yours now. You have to insure it.
Yeah.
So she thought she was getting a bargain at $550 and immediately was like, oh, yeah, no.
Welcome to the auction house.
Yeah. So they tried for years. I mean, it was just
so it ended up
maybe
in pieces,
a few
I guess.
years ago. Yeah, that they were out there and they had to cut it all down just to transport it out, and those materials were just basically scrap at that point.
And that's the history of the amphitheater.
So along with the amphitheater, which is unfortunately gone at this point, although they have reconfigured that West Festival grounds to where there are concerts there again. We see it when we get over to Oktoberfest specifically, but some of the other proposals that have come about, Blue Rose, which was more recently known as the Sandbar. Again, not sure what it's going to be, but that was in 2010, so almost 50 years after that was first proposed. Our friend Ted Reeds was the architect that designed that. What a unique location, what a unique design to have it hanging over the river. And now that there's permanent water in the river again, and of course, y'all know my favorite place, Elwood's. It is my neighborhood bar, so it is walking distance from where I live. It was opened back in the 90s. Many people will remember it as River's Edge. Opened in the 90s, closed, maybe 10 years later before reopening as Elwood's when they opened up the new Blue Rose. So these things that we just talked about, like the aquarium, the amphitheater, the Blue Rose, that eventually came to fruition, man, we have seen a lot of plans that, were not good, and probably for the best that they did not come into fruition.
And I think some of that was influenced with the Oklahoma City River Walk, which was influenced again by probably San Antonio and everything like that. But, the idea to have that here in Tulsa, what was 2006 called the Channels, it was a concept that was never developed, but probably for the better because there's a lot of, not only the infrastructure needs to be built, but you also need emergency vehicles that are water patrolled. And just more stuff that I don't think they necessarily put into full effect, but it would have allowed for kind of this waterway through the city. And I believe it went through 6th Street and
Yeah, there were a couple of those designs. The channels specifically, actually a great idea. I've seen artist renderings that just look phenomenal. We were in no position to handle that. So it was building islands out in the Arkansas River, and then on those islands, putting basically high-rise apartments, so multi-use. There would be, of course, retail, entertainment, restaurants, along the ground level, and then the towers would be both offices and residences. And so, for 2006, this was a great idea of kind of, a multi-use. Theoretically, the idea was that you could live out on these Channel Islands and, just not have to leave the islands, because everything you would need would be right there contained within that multi-use feature. The one that immediately comes to mind for me is the expressway. So they wanted to make Riverside Drive an expressway, like we've seen, in other cities that have since gotten rid of those expressways over, valuable areas. Riverside Drive would have been a 6-lane expressway. And not only that, it would connect directly to the IDL, to the interdispersal loop. So there's that southeast corner. So what is that going to be like? 15th and Detroit, 15th and Cincinnati area of the IDL. They would have taken over the Midland Valley right-of-way. Mm-hmm. So what we now know is the Midland Valley Trail that goes around the backside of Gathering Place. It goes by 18th and Boston. So many people are familiar with that crosswalk. They're on 21st Street, right by the Council Oak Elementary. So that's Midland Valley Trail. So all of those areas would have been taken out. Sorry, man, Mercury Lounge probably would have just had to go. But all those businesses and homes would have been taken out to build a 6-lane expressway connecting the interdispersal loop, and then it would connect again basically where Gathering Place is now to a 6-lane Riverside expressway.
And obviously Gathering Place is hard to miss, and something that we probably haven't mentioned enough, but there, prior to that, there was the Tulsa Wave Park, which was kind of
yes.
PSO's development on the other side of the river.
Yeah, it was on the west side by the soccer fields.
And that's where whitewater rafting, which, again, some of that hobby kind of took place. So the stuff that whitewater rafting that we're seeing today could have possibly been influenced. But basically what we're trying to say is, all these bond issues and all these ambitious projects kind of brought us to where we are today. Obviously the original dam would need to be repaired, and it was instead taken out. The groundbreaking for the new dam, which was in 2020. But we see, one of the largest, publicly owned parks in America, as well as the aquarium, the planetarium we have. It's just not on the river.
True.
We have a lot of really water recreation, if it's Mohawk Park or
the Science Museum is now Discovery Lab.
Yeah, so I think, a lot of these, ideas came to fruition, but kind of in their own way. It wasn't a part of this 50-year program or 15-year program. It was really just people working together, but, it was kind of those ideas that were planted and eventually kind of grew into what we see today, which is a 2.5-mile body of water called Zinc Lake with the low water flume is what they keep calling it. And you've seen
I'm excited
the videos.
To see it in action. Somebody was out there recently and got some footage. So
I think it was a press release type thing. They wanted
right
as
from
many
the
people.
River Parks of the city.
I think almost everybody had footage. But yeah, that was they're planning, like I mentioned earlier, whitewater kayaking, paddle boating, rowing, and river surfing. But again, if you look at it, and I haven't really been down there,
I am there often.
Yeah, it's really just on that far.
Okay, so yes,
the side that usually has more water,
closest to the east bank. So okay, there's a few things going on. So there are 7 gates to this low water dam. Each of them can release water at a different rate. So therefore, each of them is more or less challenging than the one next to it. So like that one on the west bank will deliver a lot of water very quickly. It's going to be very, very fast. So the one closer to the east bank of the river is going to put out a lesser amount of water, still at a greater speed, but you can do different activities on the water, be it, sailing, something related to kayaking. All these different activities, depending on your skill level, can be done in the different sections. The one I'm most curious about is that east side where they have those different pools lined up as you go downriver.
And so, yeah, they're obviously none of this is open yet, but they're getting prepared for Labor Day, and it's going to be somewhat reminiscent of the Aqua Fest, except this is the big damn party. Hopefully, we'll see you guys out there at some point.
Party at my place.
Yeah, party over there.
You know where it is. So from my perspective, being a now 10-year resident of Riverview and living right on the river parks, not only seeing the changes that have occurred, and there have been a lot of changes in the past 10 years, there was no gathering place. The Blair Mansion was still there. The old pedestrian bridge was still there. The old playground at the 17th Street Plaza. A lot of things have changed, a lot of things that people miss, but I am really excited for all of the new developments. And, making reference to the way things were in the 80s when this first started to open up, I think we're living through that again right now. So I really implore y'all, come on down. Come down to the Great Dam Party. Come down or the Big Dam Party, whatever we're going to call it. It's going to be great, that's for sure. Tulsa Tough and Crybaby Hill. Tulsa Spotlight Theater. Hey, we're still putting on shows, and this is going to be a big weekend for us. So many activities as we look forward to the reopening of Blue Rose. I mean, it's just, yes, it is going to be a banner weekend. Mark your calendars. That's Labor Day weekend 2024. Tulsa River Parks, the Arkansas River is the place to be.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing you, and you can keep up to date, like I said, with the water quality dashboard online if you feel like jumping in the water. Again, not to swim, but
it
yeah,
happens, and it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's going to happen. There were plenty of people swimming during the raft race every year, but that takes a little bit of alcohol to kill some of the bacteria,
I could say more, but nope, I won't.
Yeah, that'll do it for this edition of the Tulsa Times podcast. I'm your host, Patrick McNicholas, joined with...
I am John Beasley.
Riverview Beasley. And if you have any thoughts, reach out to us, of course, social media at TulsaPast or TulsaPast.com. I want to thank our listeners and everyone that's been supporting us, spreading the word about this podcast. Even though we've been off the air, we've still been getting plays, and we're glad to have some more content for you. A quick reminder, you can find us anywhere you get your podcast. Just search Tulsa Times Podcast, and you will see the episodes listed. We're on number 6, and episode 7's coming your way soon. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, stay up to date with the latest episodes. And that'll do it. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tulsa Times Podcast.